Hello, very beautiful community. You're going to help me today because my health is borderline up for our lovely talk that we're going to have. And at the end, I'll gossip a tiny bit because I get so many questions about these cards that are up behind me. So I'll say a little bit about them. And I'll also say a little bit about conversations, of which more are coming, about Israel Gaza on the channel and the way that we are at risk of reacting unconstructively. It's just a couple of bits of stuff at the back. Let's get going. What are we doing today? We're reading Yuval Noah Harari's piece in the Financial Times titled Why Ukraine is Winning the War. Yuval has got zinged for this piece, and we're going to read it together. He's got zinged because it feels nauseatingly optimistic to people. But it's not clear to me that Yuval should be nauseatingly optimistic. So what is going on? We're going to read the piece together and react. I have a feeling that we might skip some sections if I feel Yuval is saying things that you all know. I don't recommend, amidst a crisis of comprehension in our culture, just skip sections as you read, but you'll forgive me for doing that just to save us a little bit of time so that we're here in 30 minutes, not 50 minutes. And Yuval's best talent in writing and in spoken word is the capacity to concentrate a thought, distill an insight in such a way that constructively stops short a busy and stressed member of the general public and encourages them to reflect. It's a wonderful public intellectual quality. Now, can I reach for my tea thermos and give it a good shake? So I'm going to fuel myself up with some homemade hemp milk tea. Very nice. And we're going to kick off. Here is Yuval. Contrary to the narrative pushed by Russian propaganda, Ukraine has so far been winning the war. Interesting. So, would I say something like that? No. But does that mean that I disagree with what Yuval is saying? Or that I must think there's something wrong with what Yuval is saying? No. Because there are different modes of truthful public intellectual communication that serves different purposes, and we'll get to talk about that. So nothing rings alarm bells necessarily in of itself from me about that sentence. Even US President Trump, who in Feb 2025 lectured Volodymyr Zelensky that he must cave into Russian demands because you don't have the cards, has this week declared that Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to win. Now, Yuval doesn't need to insert this, but it is a footnote that Trump specifically said, if you Europeans get your act together, in theory, there's no limit to how much you could help Ukraine make progress, even to the point of regaining all of its territory. That's the gist of what Trump said. Trump didn't say Ukraine's going to get back its territory. He didn't say, I support Ukraine getting back all its territory. And he didn't say the Europeans will help Ukraine get its territory. The Europeans could, in theory, do even that. Whether they are going to do it is a separate question. Whether they could do it in practice, whether it's remotely realistic, even if it's theoretically possible. I'm also not legislating on that. That was Donald Trump's statement. So you've got to characterize it correctly. The defining meaning there, the emphasis there is not Ukraine getting its territory back, it's America withdrawing from Europe and withdrawing from the Russo-Ukrainian war to a degree. You know that Trump has since turned a bit, in language at least, on Moscow. And Moscow are reacting to it as though that's just an episodic phase, and Putin is continuing to butter up Trump, continuing to speak about how Trump deserved the Nobel Peace Prize and so on. And we'll see where that lands. Trump's hope is still that he can buddy up with Putin. But he is concerned that that might not be realistic anymore. But that doesn't mean, of course, that Trump's ideological affinity with Putin goes anywhere, and nor does it mean that Trump's narcissistic dependence on Putin goes anywhere. It's a hard thing for that kind of dependence to break. So what will happen instead is, rather than Trump, if he continues to be less friendly to Russia, ends up thinking, well, I'd love to be friends with Vlad. I'm really missing out on not being friends with Vlad, but for a couple of other reasons I can't control, I can't quite be friends with Vlad, which is a shame because it would be a beautiful friendship, but we can't have it. But if we could have it, it would be very strong. So that's going to be where Trump is at if he continues to take a more negative stance on Russia. When the conflict began in 2014, Ukraine seemed completely helpless in the face of Russian aggression, and the Russians easily conquered Crimea and other parts of Ukraine. The war entered a more intense phase on Feb 2022, when the Russians mounted an all-out assault aiming to subdue the whole of Ukraine and end its existence as an independent nation. The original Russian invasion in Feb 2022 was a kind of a blend between a full-scale invasion and an attempt at a coup. At the time, the Russian leadership and many observers throughout the world expected Russia to conquer Kiev and defeat the Ukrainian army decisively in days. Even Ukraine's Western backers were so unsure of Ukraine's chances of resistance, that they offered to evacuate Zelensky. Let's move on. But Zelensky said, I need ammunition, not a ride. And then the Ukrainian army eventually counterattacked in late summer 2022, etc. Let's move forward. You know about that. Since then, notwithstanding limited gains by both sides, the front line hasn't moved much. You know about that. In 2025, at a cost of 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers killed and injured, the Russian army has so far managed to capture just a thin sliver of the frontier zone, amounting, according to reliable sources, to around 0.6% of Ukraine's total territory, something you can't see easily on a proper map of Ukraine. Let's move on. The situation is reminiscent of the Western Front in the First World War, when ruthless generals sacrificed tens of thousands of soldiers to gain a few kilometers of muddy ruins. Patriotic newspapers often hid the magnitude of such follies by printing maps that purported to show major advances. But the most important data in these maps was their scale. As the historian Toby Thacker noted, First World War newspapers often used a deliberately large scale, which made the advances appear superficially impressive, but any astute reader would have seen that they were insignificant. In many newspapers, the accurate geographical detail flatly contradicted the constant reporting of gains and advances. It's the same with the latest Russian advances. For Ukraine, it makes good military sense to make tactical retreats and preserve its strength and the lives of its soldiers. Now, of course, what we've got to always keep in mind is that in our culture, there's a very unconstructive but understandable, predictably unconstructive conversation, whereby you've got people whose careers are dedicated to telling you how bad things are going for Russia, and you've got people whose careers are dedicated to telling you how bad things are going for Ukraine. What you have an insufficiency of is an on the one hand, on the other hand conversation about the relative weakness and the relative progressive weakness of the two parties. As Mark Galeotti likes to say, both parties are losing the war, but perhaps one party is losing the war more quickly than the other. As retired Australian Major General Mick Ryan recently wrote, it's as if more than 3 years after invading Iraq in 2003, the US had only managed to capture 20% of the country while sustaining 1 million casualties in the process. Now, of course, that's a helpful illustration. It is also true that the aims of Russia and the United States in these two conflicts, respectively, are very different. Russia's aim is ungovernability in Ukraine and a degree of control exercised over Ukrainian politics, such that Ukraine can't be a politically independent nation. And then the deployment of that reality, that asphyxiation of Ukraine's political autonomy, as a way of undermining Western alliances and undermining Western democracies at home. So immediately one consequence appears once you accept that these are the aspirations of the Kremlin. And that's that the continuation of the war is itself part of what the Russians are looking for. They're looking for success, but they're also feeling their goals are met just in virtue of the continuation of the war, because the goals are essentially political. They are only secondarily territorial, and moreover, they're political beyond Ukrainian borders. The chief political target is actually Western democratic stability and the coherence of Western alliances. Then, secondarily, it's about Ukraine, but only secondarily. Let's move on. At sea, Ukrainian achievements have been equally impressive, and you know this history, so we'll skip. In the air, too, Russia has failed, and you know this, and we will skip. Let's get to the bottom of this page. Consequently, in 2022, sorry, Yuval, we're skipping, but it's okay. You can always pause the screen or go to the FT to read. Consequently, in 2022, Ukrainians won the victories in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Kherson with only limited weaponry. If they'd been given the full support from the beginning, they might have won the war by late 2022 or 2023. Well, hypothetically, they could have evicted the Russians from the territory the Russians occupied since 2022. It's not clear how that becomes a victory. I mean, the war doesn't stop if the Russians are evicted. Why would it stop? It's not a territorial war. The Russians would continue fighting. But I take Yuval's point that there could have been a very different outcome for Ukraine if it was a proper proxy war from the beginning. It became a proxy war later. Proxy war is not a negative term, despite the common usage of it as a negative term. It just means that Ukraine is fighting for its freedom, but in fighting for its freedom, it's dependent on the machinations of the domestic politics of various major powers, the United States above all. At the beginning, it wasn't that much of a proxy war because the West, A, was scared of nuclear escalation, and B, even more importantly, simply lacked a strategy. The Biden administration's position in the opening months of the war was, let's keep reflecting on what Putin is trying to achieve, even though we don't know what it is. And let's keep reassessing where we are every 3 to 6 months and then seeing where we go from there. There wasn't a sort of a North Star of how you envisage security on the East European, on the ex-Soviet space. It was just, let's see how we go for another few months and then reassess. In 2025, the weakest link in Ukraine's defense still lies in the minds of its Western friends. As Russia has failed to gain air and naval superiority or to break through the Ukrainian defenses on land, Russian strategy seeks to outflank the Ukrainian position by attacking the will of Americans and Europeans. By spreading propaganda that Russian victory is inevitable, the Russians hope the Americans and Europeans will lose heart. And so Yuval is saying the Russian victory is inevitable if Western support for Ukraine collapses, and it's very far from inevitable if Western support for Ukraine increases. The trouble here, however, is that it would be a mistake to do what most military analysts who express political views, and indeed political commentators in this sphere do, which is talk about Europe in particular waking up. The limitations on what Europe can do are not limitations largely of willpower. They're limitations that stem from democratic incapacity. That's different. So the rallying cry for the Europeans should not be get your willpower going. It should be begin to regenerate democratically, stabilize yourselves, stabilize the toxic descent into post-truth polarization in your society. Is much easier said than done. In fact, it's not entirely a reversible process, but we can make it less bad. So this is the point. If we're talking about Western strategic purpose in Ukraine, European strategic purpose in Ukraine, what you should start the conversation with is actually not military matters. It's actually not talk about willpower. It's actually democratic stabilization. And this is nearly obvious. I don't want to say it's obvious because that's not quite true. Most things that are important truths are importantly true, but not obviously true. Well, this is an important truth that's near obvious, not quite obvious, but we are failing to comprehend it, largely because there's a certain compartmentalization of disciplines. It's people who are country experts on Ukraine or Russia, people who are military experts, don't know that much about how their own democracies work. And then there's a certain degree of denial. Well, things aren't going badly, but we're going to bounce back. Well, no, you're on course for a Trumpian wave in the next cycle of European elections. So this stuff does not naturally bounce back without you doing something about it. So, but Yuval says, rightly, don't succumb to Russian propaganda about inevitability because this does depend on what the Europeans do. I add the footnote that what the Europeans do is a much less open-ended question than we might think. It's a much more constrained question. As Russia continues to expand its military and its war economy, Europe is scrambling to rearm. But at the moment, Yuval says, we've still got Ukraine, that's the biggest army around, and we shouldn't be oblivious to that fact. That it is the most experienced fighting force standing between Russia and Warsaw, Paris, and Berlin. After the last 2 weeks, when we've seen all of this drone activity in Europe, what we can conclude is that Europe's biggest asset will be the Ukrainian army. The US military too has much to learn from Ukraine's battlefield experience and cutting-edge weapons industry. It is probably part of the reason President Trump has lately become more supportive of Ukraine. That's an optimistic statement. He likes to back winners. That's an optimistic statement. That Trump likes to back winners, though, is true. It's impossible to tell how the war will develop, since it depends on future decisions. But in one respect, the Ukrainian victory is already decisive and irreversible. Well, Yuval says that Ukraine's sustenance of its independence is an irreversible victory. You couldn't quarrel with that unless you thought, which we should think, actually, that Ukraine's independence looks relatively stable for now, but not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed. So if Ukraine collapses as an autonomous political entity in the next decade, Yuval will be wrong. There is no reason why that shouldn't happen. It just looks unlikely, thankfully. War is not won by the side that conquers the most land, destroys the most cities, or kills the most people. War is won by the side that achieves its political aims. So here you could say, well, let's talk about Ukraine's political aims, because it's a very impoverished view of Ukraine's political aims to say that all they are after is just independence. And Yuval is not saying that, he's just censoring that. But this is something we might come back to, because very often in pro-Ukrainian accounts that Westerners get presented with, there's a real absence of Ukraine there. There's a real absence of Ukrainian agency. I always make the observation that even the most soft fascistically psychologized supporters of Ukraine, people who don't just say that Russia is organized a disgusting imperial invasion, but that Russia is Russia with a double Z, and Russians are all orcs, soft fascistized language. But even these people, in a way that's utterly humiliating for them, of course, know more about Russia than Ukraine, right? Even the most unconstructive, voices of that kind are still going to know more about sort of Shoigu and Patrushev than about Yermak. That's weird, right? It's not surprising, but it is pretty weird. That Western supporters of Ukraine know so little about Ukraine. There is always a conversation about Ukrainian agency. Well, let's jump to the final bit here. In many of his speeches and essays, Putin has argued that Ukraine was never a real nation, as he did in the piece on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which you all know about. Nobody knows how many more people will die because of Putin's delusions and ambitions. But one thing has been made abundantly clear to the entire world, that Ukraine is real. It's a real nation, contrary to Putin's fantasies. Nations aren't made up of clumps of earth or drops of blood. They are made of stories, images, and memories in people's minds. No matter how the war unfolds in the coming months, the memory of the Russian invasion, of Russian atrocities, and of Ukrainian sacrifices will continue to sustain Ukrainian patriotism for generations to come. So, before I give you my verdict on Yuval's piece, let's just say a little bit about Ukrainian agency. Yeah, Ukraine wants to survive as an independent nation. But Ukraine also wants to get its territory back. And it's a good question, what degree of loss of territory is compatible with Ukraine's political and economic sustainability for decades to come? We also mustn't forget the calamity the Russians are orchestrating on the occupied territory. Apartheid-type calamity. We should also be clear that Ukraine has lost tens upon tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of people killed in action and so many more wounded. Ukraine has also lost millions of people who have left the country. Ukraine is facing very significant economic challenges, very significant challenges of governance. Ukraine is also facing challenges about the authoritarian turn that happens when a country is mobilized for war, and when a country does not sustain, because it's at war, pluralistic political competition. So Ukraine's in a very bad way. Ukraine is about to face the worst winter of the war so far, without doubt. Ukraine needs much more Western support. It is not in a comfortable position. So that's a more realistic talk about Ukrainian agency. Do I think that Yuval is oblivious about this or is ignorant about it? No, I don't. I think what he's rather done here, coming to my assessment of the piece, is engaged in a fairly proper public intellectual exercise where he makes a constructively manipulative intervention. And the manipulation is to say this. Let's look at discourse in the West. We can see that there is too much fatalistic discourse about how Russia inevitably is going to win. Well, it's not going to win. It depends in part on what the West does. So let me speak to Westerners about Ukrainian ingenuity, about Ukrainian resilience, about the realness of the Ukrainian state and just convey how inspiring so many things that Ukraine has achieved are over the last few years, as a way of reawakening some Western citizens who might read me to the fact that this is an open story, and it's an open story that's in part up to you, dear reader, Western citizen. So don't fall for the fatalistic narrative that this is so structurally set up in Russia's favor that if you support Ukraine, you're effectively sending good money after bad. That's the challenge. That's what Yuval wanted to challenge, and he's appropriately challenged it. So I think it's an okay piece. I don't have a problem with it. I think he's got criticized for saying things that in historical terms look terribly optimistic. But I don't think that what Yuval is doing here is giving an analytical account of who is winning and who is losing really in the way that could be reconstructed into a set of propositions that could then be presented in an academic paper. If that was the kind of case we were looking for from Yuval's piece for the claim that Ukraine is winning, we're not going to get it here. And what we'll get is a bit rhetorical and a bit moralized and a bit shallow. But that's not to understand what Yuval has done. So I think he has engaged in a reasonable public intellectual intervention, and quite frankly, it's irrelevant whether I would do it differently or not. I don't fundamentally see anything wrong with it. I think it's okay. Once you understand it properly. I think if you misunderstand what he is saying, and you think it's a sober, cold argument for how Ukraine is winning or how Ukraine is genuinely losing more slowly than the Russians are losing, with various kinds of evidence behind that, well, that's just not what Yuval's done. So I think it's a completely proper sort of prophylactic against certain kinds of fatalistic corrosiveness. So that's my take. That's my take from what we've read together. And I apologize we haven't read together the complete piece. Now, a couple of quick remarks. I had a tiny chat yesterday, and much more is coming, I promise, soon, on Gaza, Israel. And with Gaza, Israel, I tend to get a lot of private correspondence and a lot of unsubscribes when I talk about this topic. And that's why many people in our algorithmic bubble don't like to go there at all. But it's my responsibility to go there, and I'll be doing a probably 1 to 2 hour long chat soonishly about really the moral implications of what happened in Gaza and what language we apply to it and how we think about it and what kind of a reckoning of, and reckoning of what kind it is for the West. But I jotted down a very quick X or Twitter post about what happens in my inboxes and my DMs when I talk about Israel and Gaza. So let me read it to you, because it'll be more condensed than what I say. When I talk about Israel and Gaza, I get two kinds of messages. Disgusting. I've watched you for years and I've lost all respect for you because you defend Israel's right to exist. Or, disgusting. I've watched you for years and I've lost all respect because you're too critical of Israel's actions in Gaza and you call it ethnic cleansing and mass slaughter, and how dare you? And I say, seen through a Nietzschean lens, these aren't moral statements at all. To put it very pompously, and it's ridiculously pompous and not quite healthy, but to put it very pompously, they are the faint cries of a decaying neoliberal civilization. They're about consumption, not conviction, or rather conviction that has morphed with consumption. It's the outrage of a consumer who expects to be served chicken but gets tofu and feels angry that their ritual of consumption has been violated. So psychologically, psychoanalytically, the complaints at both ends actually have the same psychic dynamism. they're identical. They happen to be saying politically or ideologically opposed things, but they're the same. And of course, we're going to get much more of this when we have our long grounded conversation. What I'll do, because it's my responsibility to do so, is to deliberately start that conversation in a very, very slow way, to almost disarm the disposition of a very small minority, but very loud minority of people, to begin putting together sort of sloganized, moralizing statements that are just expressions of consumerism fundamentally, as well as also sometimes expressions of a kind of a bizarre ownership, right? But the ownership itself, I think, is a consumerist thing. You feel you have a degree of ownership over the newspaper you consume, the essayist you consume, the YouTuber you consume, and you think, well, I didn't order that. Why are they saying this? That wasn't. I didn't pay for that. I didn't pay for that with my time. I didn't order it. It's like I've gone on Amazon and I've ordered a barbecue and I've got a chicken coop that came. I'm not happy. Yeah? Yeah? It's a kind of a failure of consumptive satisfaction. So that's what I want to say about that. Now, a lot of you ask, what the hell are these things? Now, they're not the kind of art I like. My preference usually at home is for 20th century surrealist art. I've got an example here. I'm not sure if I can reach for it. This is I don't think you can actually see it properly. This is a Max Neumann limited edition signed print. That's as best as I can do. And I've got quite a few of these. And these are remarkable things because they are about freedom in a specific way. They're about freedom in the transparency, in the unobtrusiveness of the connection between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And that's why a lot of pictures that seem very dark, like this one, to people who don't have a taste for this sort of art, properly understood, they aren't dark at all. They are about freedom, liberation, and about dance as opposed to rigidity. But these are cards by, I think, an English artist called Mark Hurd, and they just come to me because I'm sick. If you're in New Zealand, or if you follow the journalistic world cleverly, this is from a dear friend, Anita McNaught, who knows that I love owls. And this is just chickens from my partner, because chickens are an animal we make lots of jokes about. They're not Russian. People often say, oh, it's Russian. No, I think of these as British chickens. I think that's all I've got to say about that. Before we get any more ridiculous, lots of love and talk very soon.